So our third and final snippet for the first part of this week looks at the emergence of imperialism, formal U.S. imperialism in the latter part of the 19th century, and it begins with events in Hawaii. So Hawaii is an independent kingdom throughout the 19th century, but one that the British, the Japanese, and the Americans all have a significant interest in. And in 1893, the American financial interests in the country, most prominently this pineapple company called Dole Pineapple, which is still around, promote a coup that topples the native Hawaiian government headed by it's a monarchy headed by a queen, and imposes an American-sponsored republic. They petition the United States for annexation. The then president of the United States, a Democrat named Grover Cleveland, opposes it, and Hawaii remains an independent country for 4 years until an expansionist Republican named William McKinley is elected, and Hawaii is then annexed to the U.S. Similarly, in the 1890s, there's an anti-Spanish rebellion in Cuba. The rebels petition the U.S. for support. In the Cleveland administration, this is largely denied, but when McKinley, it comes in 1896, is more supportive. He sends a U.S. naval vessel called the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to sort of project American power in the area. It explodes. It's widely reported at the time that the Spanish had somehow exploded the ship. It turns out this was not the case at all. It was an accident, but this increases pressure for war on behalf of Cuban freedom against the Spanish. And this, by and large, fits with the agenda of William McKinley. He was elected in 1896 in a decisive victory. Campaigns on a platform more supportive of the idea of imperialism. He supports U.S. economic expansion, U.S. strategic expansion. He populates his administration, especially his Undersecretary of the Navy, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, with supporters of expansion. And he envisions the United States as a global power. McKinley, although Cuba is the dominant issue in terms of international affairs in the U.S. In 1897 and 1898, McKinley is very interested in expanding access to East Asia as well, especially China. There is this kind of myth of a China market, that the China market is just about to be opened and it's going to lead to extraordinary riches. But there's a fear that if the United States doesn't have a major colony, at least somewhere near China, where the U.S. can station naval vessels, where the U.S. can station refueling stations for coal-powered vessels that are traveling in the region. If the U.S. doesn't have a colony in this area, that could prove to be problematic. And you can kind of see on the map, the British have their colonies in India and Burma and Malaya. The French have their colonies in modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Japanese have acquired colonies in Korea and Taiwan. Mongolia is nominally independent, as is Manchuria, but they're under Russian control. The Dutch control Indonesia. And the Philippines, which is under Spanish control, but is facing an anti-colonial rebellion, emerges as one of the few areas surrounding China that hasn't been conquered by the outside world. And it will be the Philippines, as we'll see, that will intersect with U.S. expansion in the region. War begins in 1898. It's overwhelmingly approved by both houses of Congress, although critically for McKinley. The declaration of war comes with a caveat. Congress passes an amendment called the Teller Amendment, which requires the war to end with Cuban independence, therefore prevents the United States from formally annexing Cuba after the war. What the U.S. eventually will wind up doing is instead demanding that the Cubans insert another amendment called the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution, which gives to the U.S. Right to intervene in Cuba militarily whenever it so chooses. It makes Cuba what's called a protectorate of the United States, where basically the U.S. is in control of Cuba's foreign policy. The Spanish are weak by this point. The real opposition to the U.S. comes from some Cuban revolutionaries who are concerned, not without reason, that the U.S. interest here is not altogether altruistic. The events in Cuba are strongly supported by Theodore Roosevelt, but so too in East Asia. Roosevelt orders the activities by the U.S. fleet in the Philippines, and here there is a much more clearly established anti-colonial rebellion than was the case in Cuba, headed by this man Emilio Aguinaldo. And it is likely that if the United States had not become involved in the war in fighting in the Philippines, Filipino nationalists under Aguinaldo would have become independent anyway. But instead, the U.S. sends troops to Manila, ostensibly as part of their war against Spain in Cuba. They quickly dispense of the Spanish, but an uneasy peace between the Filipino revolutionaries and the Americans, eventually by late 1898, early 1899, breaks out into an all-out conflict. The Filipinos want independence. The Americans want a colony in the Philippines from which they could access the China market. This is a brutal war. It is a war of a type with which the U.S. will become familiar in the 20th and indeed the 21st century, where a weaker foe blends into the civilian population, kind of guerrilla warfare. And the response of the army to this is what's known as the water cure. You can see a couple of photographs of this occurring at the time. We would now call this waterboarding. So basically, you pour water into the captured Filipinos' mouth. It simulates drowning to force them to reveal where the rebels might be hiding, that particular week or that particular month. It is effective. The Filipino rebellion is broken in 1902, 1903. It does, however, when these photos come out, they were initially censored by the army. The water cure leads to a popular backlash. This is a Life magazine, the cover of major news magazine of the day, and largely checks additional U.S. expansion in Southeast Asia. So the U.S. acquires Philippines as a colony, but it ultimately doesn't go too much further. So this is the U.S. empire in the Pacific as of the very early 20th century. The U.S. controlling Alaska as a territory. There's no sense that Alaska is going to be admitted as a state at this point. The U.S. controlling Hawaii and the Midway Islands, strategically, economically vital in the Central Pacific. The U.S., along with the Germans and the British, control portions of Samoa. The U.S. controlling the Philippines, and eventually it will also assume control of the Mariana Islands. So the U.S. has now suddenly become a major player in international imperialism, despite the fact that ostensibly it is an anti-colonial state. The U.S. is it's a colony that became independent. And in 1900, this imperialist vision is confirmed. McKinley's first vice president passes away. Theodore Roosevelt is put on the ticket in his place. The Democrats nominate a man named William Jennings Bryan, who runs on an anti-imperialist platform. He is crushed, and there is this sense that the public is comfortable with the U.S. playing a greater role, and that's going to transition us into what we'll be looking at later this week with regards to progressivism. So that is it for the snippets for this week, or at least the first part of this week. We'll do another batch of snippets on Thursday.